Tunnels have a reputation that goes beyond their function. Across cultures and regions, people describe them as places they don't linger unless they have to. They're enclosed, directional, and built to be passed through quickly. When they are active, filled with traffic, sound, and movement, they feel utilitarian. When they're abandoned, that same design often produces a different reaction. Reports tied to tunnels tend to follow a familiar pattern. People describe hearing footsteps or voices when no one is present. Some report seeing movement at the edges of their vision or feeling watched without identifying a source. Others describe a sudden sense of unease that causes them to leave without being able to explain why. These reports appear in railroad tunnels, roadway tunnels, and underground passages across multiple countries. What makes these accounts notable is that they are not limited to one location or one period of time. Similar stories emerge wherever large tunnels fall out of use and remain accessible. In many cases, the tunnels were not sites of documented tragedy, they were working structures that just became empty. This episode looks at several of those tunnels, not to prove that they're haunted, and not to dismiss what people are saying when they say they are haunted, but to understand why abandoned tunnels, more than many other structures, repeatedly become places where people will report fear, presence, and unexplained experience. To do that, we need to look at how these tunnels were built, how they were used, and what happened after they were left behind. Welcome to Arcane Station. I'm your host, Mike Porter. I've always been drawn to stories of hauntings, not because I'm looking for a spectacle, but because so many of these stories come from ordinary people describing moments they didn't expect and couldn't easily explain. Now, over the years, I've had my own experiences that I would describe as paranormal. They weren't dramatic, at least most of them weren't, and they didn't come with the clear answers that I wanted, but they were enough to convince me that there are aspects of reality we don't fully understand. When I started hearing about tunnels being described as haunted, that caught my attention. Not one tunnel, but many of them. Railroads, roadways, drainage tunnels, different locations, different histories, but very similar reports. People talked about voices, footsteps, figures, and a sense of presence that appeared quickly and without warning. In some cases, these tunnels had no history of violence or tragedy. They were simply abandoned. That raised a question worth investigating. Why do tunnels, more than any other abandoned structures, with the probable exception of mine shafts, why do these consistently attract these types of reports of hauntings or strange noises within? So I'm not going to try to prove whether ghosts exist, because I believe they do. I've seen stuff. It's about examining a pattern. We're looking at 5 specific tunnels, but this could really be any abandoned tunnel. So there's the Crozet Tunnel in Virginia, the Stumphouse Tunnel in South Carolina, the Lakeview Drive Tunnel in North Carolina, and the Arroyo Parkway Tunnel in California, as well as the Screaming Tunnel near Niagara Falls. Each one has its own history, and each one also has a reputation. We'll start by looking at how these tunnels were built and why they were abandoned. Then we'll examine what people report experiencing inside of them. After that, we'll look at how those reports have been treated by ghost hunting groups, tourists, and government agencies. And finally, we'll explore several theories that attempt to explain why these spaces feel the way they do. Now, there may not be a final answer, but there is enough consistency here to justify taking the question seriously. The tunnels examined in this episode were built for practical reasons tied to transportation and infrastructure. None were designed as a destination, and none were intended to be occupied outside of its active use. Their later reputations developed only after those original purposes ended. The Crozet Tunnel in Virginia was constructed in the mid-19th century as part of the Virginia Central Railroad. Completed in 1858, it allowed trains to pass through the Blue Ridge Mountains rather than over them. For its time, it was a major engineering achievement and remained in regular use for decades. As train sizes increased and rail standards changed, a newer tunnel was constructed nearby. The original Crozet Tunnel was closed to rail traffic, and in the 1940s it was sealed for many years before eventually reopening as a pedestrian tunnel. The Stumphouse Tunnel in South Carolina was begun in the 1850s as well as part of that Blue Ridge Railroad. The project was ambitious and expensive. Workers carved into solid rock using hand tools and black powder. But funding collapsed before the tunnel could be completed. Construction stopped with the tunnel partially finished. It was never sealed and remained accessible after abandonment, eventually becoming part of a state park. The Lakeview Drive Tunnel, often called the Road to Nowhere, sits outside of Bryson City, North Carolina. It was built after World War II as part of a promised replacement road following the construction of Fontana Dam, which was used as a hydroelectric dam for production of aluminum and things like that for wartime efforts. The dam flooded communities along the Little Tennessee River, displacing residents. The federal government committed to building a new road to maintain access to former homes and cemeteries. Construction began and the tunnel was completed, but the road beyond it was never built. Rising costs, environmental concerns, and shifting priorities brought the project to a halt in the 1970s. In California, the Arroyo Parkway Tunnel was part of an early roadway development near Pasadena, built to manage traffic flow and drainage as automobile use increased. Sections of the tunnel system later fell out of use as infrastructure changed. Portions were sealed or restricted, while others remained locally known as unused or transitional spaces rather than active roadways. The Screaming Tunnel near Niagara Falls has had the least clearly documented origin. Built in the early 20th century, it appears to have functioned as a drainage or utility tunnel beneath the roadway. It was never intended for public access. While the construction purpose is recorded in municipal planning documents, its later identity developed almost entirely through local tradition rather than official use. Across all 5 locations, the pattern is consistent. Each tunnel was built to serve movement, traffic, or infrastructure. Each lost that function due to replacement, financial collapse, or changing priorities. The structures themselves remained. They're intact enough to enter but disconnected from regular use. Once active traffic stopped, access became informal and intermittent. These tunnels shifted from controlled environments to places where people entered deliberately rather than by necessity. It was after that shift that reports of unusual experiences began to circulate, moving these tunnels from infrastructure into local lore. Once these tunnels were no longer in regular use, accounts of unusual activity began to circulate through local communities, media coverage, and visitor testimony. While the details vary by location, the types of reports show clear overlap. At the Crozet Tunnel, visitors walking in the tunnel after its reopening as a pedestrian passage have reported hearing footsteps behind them when no one else was visible. In addition to auditory reports, some hikers have described seeing shadow-like movement ahead of them or near the tunnel walls, particularly in low-light conditions. These sightings are typically brief and not described as interactive. Reports often note that the movement disappears once a person stops or changes direction. The Stumphouse Tunnel has a long-standing reputation for both auditory and visual phenomena. Visitors and park staff have described hearing voices, knocking, and movement from within the unfinished sections of the tunnel. Some visitors have also reported seeing mist-like forms or brief flashes of light deeper inside the tunnel, and often near areas where natural light doesn't reach. These visual reports are inconsistent in detail but recur frequently enough to be mentioned in regional media coverage and tourism features. At the Lakeview Drive Tunnel, reports most often focus on sound and presence, but visual experiences are also described. Some visitors report seeing human-shaped figures or shadows at a distance inside the tunnel that vanish as they approach. Others describe brief points of light or reflections that cannot immediately be traced to vehicles, flashlights, or external sources. Some people also talk about time distortion, where they go in thinking they're only there for 20 minutes and end up being in there for at least 2 hours, sometimes more. These accounts appear in visitor interviews and local media segments and are typically reported without accompanying explanation. The Arroyo Parkway Tunnel has generated fewer widely documented reports due to restricted access, but locals and urban exploration forums describe visual disturbances in unused sections of the tunnel system. These include seeing movement in the peripheral vision and occasional light anomalies in areas without active electrical systems. Because access is limited, these reports remain anecdotal and are not widely investigated. The Screaming Tunnel near Niagara Falls is most closely associated with auditory phenomena, but visual reports also exist. Some visitors claim to have seen figures or light changes inside the tunnel at night, often describing as fleeting or indistinct. Now, the Screaming Tunnel has its name because there is a scream that's associated with it, and they believe that it's a young girl that had died from a fire. So these accounts usually accompany a better-known reports of screaming or crying sounds and are presented in local media as part of a long-standing regional folklore. Across all 5 tunnels, visual phenomena are reported less frequently than the auditory ones, but they follow a similar pattern. They are brief, distant, and non-interactive. Witnesses rarely describe sustained apparitions or direct engagement. There are no verified reports of physical harm attributed to unexplained causes at any of these locations, so I believe they're fairly safe. The combination of sound, visual anomalies, and a sense of presence has reinforced each tunnel's reputation over time. While the reports remain anecdotal, their recurrence across different tunnels and regions has kept these locations associated with paranormal activity long after their original purpose ended. As reports of unusual activity became associated with these tunnels, the responses to those claims varied depending on who was encountering them and who was responsible for managing the sites. What stands out is not a coordinated effort to investigate, but a pattern of cautious distance and denial. At the Crozet Tunnel, the reopening of the structure as a pedestrian tunnel brought increased attention. Local authorities and preservation groups focused primarily on safety, lighting, and controlled access. Reports of footsteps, voices, or visual anomalies were acknowledged informally in media interviews, but were not addressed through any formal inquiry. The tunnel's status as a historical landmark framed public discussion around engineering and preservation rather than unexplained activity. Visitors who shared paranormal experiences generally did so through personal accounts, blogs, or interviews rather than through official channels. The Stumphouse Tunnel has attracted interest from ghost hunting groups for decades. Paranormal investigators frequently visit the site, particularly at night, and publish their findings independently through television programs, online videos, and written reports. These groups often document sound, temperature changes, and visual anomalies using recording equipment. Park officials, however, do not participate or endorse in these investigations. State park management has consistently framed the tunnel as a historical and recreational site, responding to activity reports by emphasizing environmental conditions and visitor safety. At the Lakeview Drive Tunnel, responses have been shaped largely by its location within a national park boundary. The National Park Service has not conducted or sponsored investigations into paranormal claims. Instead, signage and public statements focus on pedestrian safety and respect for the site. Local residents and visitors continue to discuss reported activity through regional media and word of mouth. While ghost hunting groups occasionally visit the tunnel, their activities are unofficial and not supported by park authorities. The Arroyo Parkway Tunnel presents a different response pattern due to its urban setting. Much of the tunnel system is restricted or closed for the public, and reports of unusual activity tend to surface through urban exploration communities rather than tourism or media coverage. Municipal authorities address the tunnels primarily as infrastructure and safety concerns, saying basically they just don't want people in there because they could get hurt and they wouldn't know that they're actually in there. So the access is limited and discussion of paranormal reports is typically dismissed or avoided altogether. This has reduced public visibility of the claims without eliminating them. The Screaming Tunnel near Niagara Falls, public response has been shaped by its long-standing status as a local legend. Tourists visit the site expecting a story rather than an investigation. Local governments generally treat the tunnel as a folklore landmark, intervening only to address trespassing or traffic issues. Paranormal investigators have conducted informal investigations over the years, but these efforts remain outside of any official framework. Across all 5 sites, the pattern is consistent. Government agencies prioritize the safety, liability, and preservation of the site. Historical organizations document construction and abandonment while avoiding discussion of paranormal claims. Ghost hunting groups pursue investigations independently and publishing results without institutional oversight. Visitors and tourists share experiences through informal channels such as Reddit, or some people even in the visitor books will write that they've had an experience. No tunnel examined in this episode has been closed specifically because of reported activity. When access is restricted, it is attributed to safety or infrastructure concerns rather than unexplained phenomena. Reports are rarely challenged directly, but they are also rarely acknowledged beyond the surface level dismissal. As a result, the reports persist in a space between belief and official recognition. They're neither validated nor erased. They remain part of how these tunnels are experienced, even as institutions responsible for them decline to take a position. That gap between experience and response sets the conditions for interpretation, which is where we're going to move next. So, by this point, several things were established. These tunnels were heavily used, then abandoned. People report similar experiences, and what I mean by heavily used, like they could have just been built and abandoned, but that activity through the process of building, it was heavily used at that point in time. So there was a lot of human effort in these spaces, even, like through the construction of it, but also in the years following that, sometimes there would be a lot of patching up of the tunnel to make sure that it was safe. So there was a lot of human activity in those spaces. So people report similar experiences across locations with no direct connection. These experiences often involve sound, presence, movement, and visual anomalies. So institutions largely avoided addressing the reports directly. So again, what remains is an interpretation. One framework frequently referenced in paranormal research is the stone tape theory. This was first discussed in psychical research in the mid-20th century. The theory proposes that environments subjected to sustained human activity may retain residual impressions of that activity. The theory doesn't suggest intelligence, awareness, or interaction. Basically what it's saying is that when they're working, the environment itself is recording that work. Right? So this model, repetitions matter more than trauma. A location where people move through that same space daily, following the same routes, producing the same sounds, may be more likely to produce a residual phenomenon than a single dramatic event. Tunnels fit this profile closely. Trains pass through on schedules. Workers perform maintenance repeatedly. In military tunnels, personnel move through the corridors in drills and operations. These activities recurred over years or decades and then stopped abruptly. Stone tape theory is often used to explain reports that are passive or patterned. Footsteps that follow the same route, voices that don't respond, figures that appear briefly and vanish without interaction. These characteristics match many of the reports associated with abandoned tunnels. The theory remains unproven, and no mechanism has ever been identified that explains how environments would store or replay information. And part of that theory is that the crystalline structures within the environment of the stone or the limestone or whatever it might be is a medium for storage, and they use crystal structures for storage of digital information as well. So even though this theory is not proven, it persists because it accounts for consistency without requiring conscious entities, right? So if it's recorded and it plays back, then that's fine because it's like a magnetic recording in a tape. A second framework involves liminal spaces, and a concept that's gained wider attention in recent years, particularly through pop culture. A liminal space is an environment designed for transition rather than occupation, so hallways, stairwells, parking garages, and tunnels that exist to move people from one place to another and not typically used as a destination. So it's also, these liminal spaces are also often portrayed as unsettling when they're empty or abandoned. And this is really visible in the video game and horror projects such as the Backrooms. In these depictions, the fear does not come from an obvious threat. It comes from being trapped in a space that was never meant to be occupied for long. So endless corridors, artificial lighting, and absence of people creates unease without requiring an antagonist. That portrayal resonates because it mirrors real-world experience. When a person enters an abandoned tunnel, they are lingering in a space designed only for passage. There's no clear cue about how long they should remain, where they should stop, or what behavior is expected. Environmental psychology suggests that this lack of resolution heightens awareness and discomfort, and in many cases that discomfort appears before any unexplained events. Related to this is the concept of kenospia, and this is described as the unease produced by places that are normally busy but are now empty. So large spaces built for crowds or constant movement feel unnatural when silent. Tunnels amplify this effect because they combine scale, confinement, and directional focus. A train tunnel without trains or a roadway tunnel without traffic violates expectation at a basic level. That violation alone can produce fear, especially in isolation. These three frameworks, so the stone tape theory, liminal space, and kenospia, overlap in meaningful ways. All involve environments shaped by human use that are later experienced outside of that context. All account for why fear often appears quickly and without obvious cause. None of them, however, fully account for every report. That brings us to a fourth possibility, one that should not be avoided simply because it resists measurement. Some of these tunnels may in fact be haunted. Now, this doesn't require every report to be true, nor does it require every tunnel to be the same. It acknowledges that human experiences include phenomena that are not yet explained by environmental or psychological models. In religious and spiritual traditions, places where human activity ends abruptly are sometimes described as unsettled. Not cursed, not dangerous, just unfinished. Several of the tunnels discussed have reports that go beyond residual patterns. So apparitions that move independently, lights that change position, experiences reported by multiple people at the same location without coordination. These accounts are not conclusive, but they do not fit neatly into a passive replay or environmental response like the stone tape theory. Science doesn't offer a way to confirm or deny such claims definitively, at least not right now. Quantum theory suggests that observation and environment interact in ways not fully understood, but it doesn't provide a mechanism for haunting. Theology allows for the possibility of spiritual presence, but doesn't offer a testable model. That gap doesn't invalidate the experiences, it defines the boundary of current understanding. It's possible that different tunnels fall into different categories. Some may produce fear through environment alone. Others may exhibit residual effects of past use. A smaller number may involve something else entirely. The investigation doesn't require choosing one explanation to the exclusion of all others. It requires acknowledging patterns, limits, and the consistency of human experience across these spaces. What is clear is that abandoned tunnels are not experienced as neutral. Whether that unease comes from memory embedded into the environment, the disruption of transitional spaces, the psychological response to emptiness, or the presence of something unseen remains unresolved. That unresolved nature is not a weakness in the investigation, it's the reason these tunnels continue to draw attention, curiosity, and fear long after they stop serving their original purpose. Looking across all the tunnels, the most consistent conclusion is not that one explanation replaces the other, but that several are operating at the same time with different influence in different spaces. Environmental conditions clearly play a role. Large underground structures affect sound, light, and orientation. Spaces designed for constant movement feel different when silent and empty. Psychological responses to scale, isolation, and emptiness are well documented, and they explain why unease often appears immediately. The concept of liminal space and canopsia adds another layer. These tunnels were built to move people and machines through them, not to be occupied in a stationary position. When their function ended and people began lingering inside them, the space no longer behaved as expected. That mismatch alone can produce discomfort, even without any unexplained event. The stone tape theory accounts for different categories of reports. Many of these tunnels were used repeatedly over long periods of time. Trains followed schedules. Workers performed the same tasks daily. Military personnel moved through the confined corridors during drills and operations. If environments can retain residual effects of sustained human activity, tunnels are a strong candidate. This framework aligns with the reports that are patterned, passive, and non-interactive. In some locations, however, the reports go beyond what these expectations or explanations comfortably cover. Apparitions, moving lights, and experiences described independently by multiple visitors suggest that something else may be occurring in certain spaces. I don't think that possibility can be dismissed simply because it resists measurement. From a biblical perspective, abandoned places are not treated as neutral. Scripture places importance on purpose, stewardship, and use. Places built for labor, passage, protection, or gathering are meant to be maintained and inhabited. When they're abandoned, they are often described as desolate or unsettled, not because they're evil, but because their intended role has ended. In that framework, emptiness itself carries consequence. Taken together, I don't believe these tunnels are explained by one cause. I believe they're shaped by multiple factors, each carrying different weight depending on the location. Environment, human memory, psychological response, spiritual influence, and history all intersect in these spaces. That combination explains why abandoned tunnels continue to generate fear, curiosity, and reports of haunting long after their practical purpose ended. They are places where function stopped, access remained, and experience changed as a result. If you visited any of these tunnels discussed in the episode or another abandoned tunnel with a similar reputation, you can share your experience with me on arcanestation.com. If you appreciate investigative approaches to hauntings and unexplained places, please consider subscribing and sharing the show with your friends. I'm Mike Porter. Thanks for listening. Have a wonderful night.